prayer with me, please? Let's pray. Oh, dear God, open our ears and our minds. Use my words that they might be pleasing to you, that they might also open our ears and our minds, that we would hear from you today. Thank you for your presence in us and with us, all around us, always. Amen. I'm going to start with the Luke passage, and then I'm going to set up the psalm before I read it. So, if you would like to follow along, I'm in Luke chapter 8, verse 22 to 25. It's a familiar story. One day, Jesus got into the boat with his disciples, and he said to them, "Let's go across to the other side of the lake." So they set out, and as they sailed, Jesus fell asleep. And a storm of wind came down the lake, and they were filling with water, and they were in danger. And they went and woke Jesus, and they said, "Master, Master, we're perishing." And Jesus woke up and rebuked the wind and the raging waves, and they ceased, and there was a calm. And Jesus said to them, "Where is your faith?" And they were afraid, and they marveled, saying to one another, "Who then is this, that he commands even winds and water, and they obey him?" The word of the Lord. So like I said before we read the words of the psalm, let's imagine David writing it. King David, right? The author, musician, used to be shepherd boy. Acquainted with all kinds of weather, we can assume, right? And let's say it's nighttime, and the air is still charged with electricity, and the earth smells damp. David sits under a large tree. It was the tree that he raced to when the storm came up out of nowhere. And so there is David. The temperature has dropped, and there is a strong wind blowing across the rocky terrain. The trees are twisting. Large clouds are beginning to kind of cloak. It was a crack of lightning that initially sent David diving under the tree, but now it's just heavy raindrops falling from the sky. And so David grabs his bag, and he pulls out his small harp that he travels with, because singing has always calmed him. And so while he's waiting out the storm, he writes the following words, Psalm 29. "Ascribe to the Lord, O heavenly beings. Ascribe to the Lord glory and strength. Ascribe to the Lord the glory due God's name. Worship the Lord in God's splendor. The voice of the Lord is over the waters. The glory of God thunders. The Lord over mighty waters. The voice of the Lord is powerful. The voice of the Lord is full of majesty. The voice of the Lord breaks the cedars. The Lord breaks the cedars of Lebanon." God makes Lebanon skip like a calf and Syrian like a young wild ox. "The voice of the Lord flashes forth flames of fire. The voice of the Lord shakes the wilderness. The Lord shakes the wilderness of Kadesh. The voice of the Lord causes the oaks to whirl. Strips the forest bare. And in God's temple all say, glory. The Lord sits enthroned over the flood. The Lord sits enthroned as king forever. May the Lord give peace to his people. May the Lord bless his people with strength." And then the storm subsides, and David stands and he stretches, and he walks home, and the smell of rain is all around him. It is David's understanding that the storm, it is David's understanding of the storm that most strikes me, right? So amidst a storm, David hears the voice of the Lord above the water. The voice of the Lord breaks through the storm. The Lord is enthroned over the flood, is what it says. So there's David experiencing weather that caught him off guard. And he turns his attention, he focuses his mind on God, who is above the storm, beyond the storm, over the storm. Now, weather is one of the few things that stops us in our tracks these days, right? Weather, by definition, right, refers to just the day-to-day temperature and precipitation, whereas climate refers to the atmospheric conditions over a longer period of time. Weather is driven by the differences in air pressure or temperature and moisture between one place and another when they collide. Meteorologists would tell us that our atmospheric system is chaotic, and that means that it is highly sensitive to initial conditions. Small differences in initial conditions can create widely separate outcomes. So when studying weather, we see that initial incidences create behavior, and then that behavior creates complex systems. I absolutely love that sentence, right? An initial incident creates behavior that creates a system. Things happen, behavior occurs, and systems form. That's true of life. That's just like, yes, that's true of weather, but that's just how life happens, right? Now, most of you know I've written a memoir. I think most of you know this. And I'm at the phase where I'm trying to send it to agents and publishers. And the memoir is about Pete's diagnosis of MS. And then mostly my acceptance or not acceptance, or adjustments or not adjustments to the storm that happened and formed around us, right? So if you would permit me, I'd like to read a portion of a chapter. The chapter is entitled, I Like to Be Ready. Superstorm Sandy ravaged a path up the eastern coast, forcing waves beyond the boardwalk. Millions of people in New Jersey were left without power. 30 miles north of this, in the stairwells of a New York City hospital, nurses carried patients to safety because the generator failed. They were ready. They had a plan and a backup plan. Both failed. I like being ready. To say I plan ahead isn't exactly true. I live ahead. My demon is the demon of not living in the present, but living instead in the future. So it's not that I plan ahead, but rather that I consistently imagine life ahead of where I actually am. Sometimes I confuse that with being ready. I like to be ready, but not like other people. When everyone else was purchasing eggs and bread and milk, I was working on next week's sermon. Last Friday, I was at the grocery store for one thing, and the place was mobbed. I asked the cashier, is it always like this at lunchtime? And she looked at me funny. No, it's the storm. I could feel my brain having to locate what she's talking about. As I looked around, I saw that everyone except me was buying batteries and bottled water. I like to be ready, but I have never considered purchasing batteries a sign of readiness. I like to be ready, but so many things important in life are really impossible to get ready for. For example, I imagine being a stepmother, but I couldn't have been ready for how two young men would steal my heart. I imagined the day Dan got married, but I was shocked by how important his wife Faith would be in my life. I imagined a baby in our family, but I was not ready for how the center of gravity would shift with her arrival. I had imagined and promised to love someone in sickness and in health, but I was not ready to see life through the eyes of disability. I had imagined life as a caregiver for someone with a progressive disease, but I was not ready for the volume of compassion required, nor for the impatience I could generate. I could imagine life filled with love, but I was not ready to fear love because of loss. So while the wind howled around us, I laid in bed and admitted to Pete, I wasn't ready for you to use a wheelchair. I wasn't ready. As many times as I have complained, at least in my head, about having to walk slower beside him, I realized that I still preferred to walk slowly with him than to walk beside a person scooting along in a motorized wheelchair. I wasn't ready for this change. Chances are I wasn't going to be ready for a lot of changes that were in my future. I was starting to think that I might need to let go of my desire to be ready. I wasn't ready for him to be a person who moved through the world in a wheelchair. I also hadn't bought batteries or bottled water. So we all know in our mind, right, that we're never really going to be ready completely. Like, we know that, and yet we really try. Most of us try really hard. We're never going to be completely ready, particularly for storms in life, because they almost always come when we're not expecting, or that we never even imagined that was the storm that was around the corner. So many things happen, and we think, this is not what I thought would happen. This is not what I was planning for. This isn't how it was going to turn out. The former stated clerk of the Presbyterian Church, his name was Grady Parsons, he had a mantra I just learned this last week. He said regularly, let's get in the boat, let's go across the lake, there will be storms, we will not die. Right? How fantastic. What a fantastic summary of that story that we all know, right? Of the disciples in the boat with Jesus. Because the disciples didn't see the storm coming, and it didn't even really look like Jesus saw the storm coming. Or maybe he didn't even care if the storm came, or maybe he just knew that storms come. And so he fell asleep. Storms happen. Weather happens. Life happens. Weather happens inside of us and outside of us, right? The weather inside of us, our emotional makeup, how we are doing. Weather happens in our relationships, how it is doing. Life will happen. Incidents will occur. Behavior will emerge because of those incidents. And systems will often form based on the behavior that's occurring. And so when we find ourselves in a storm, might we listen for the voice that is above the storm, right? Because that's what I heard David did. There was this storm, and he heard that there is a voice that rises above the storm. That the voice of the Lord actually breaks through the storm, right? That if we listen for the voice of God, wisdom will break through the storm, and we will know what's happening. The storm won't go away, but we will know what's happening in the middle of the storm. Let's listen for the voice of the Lord that breaks through the storm. Let's look for God who is enthroned above the flood, is what David said, right? That even when there is flood water happening inside and outside, can we imagine that God is above the flood? Can we set our mind not on the storm, but on the one over and through the storm? Amen. Would you stand with me as we affirm our faith together?